Hey everyone, before we dive into this wild story, please hit that subscribe button to join our community and never miss an update. I'd spent weeks perfecting my presentation for the annual tech conference, a career-defining moment. My slides were meticulously crafted, each one a masterpiece of data and visuals meant to impress. But as I stood backstage, nerves buzzing, my secretary, Emma, handed me a USB drive with a sly grin. "Trust me," she said, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I didn't think much of it. Emma was reliable, always 2 steps ahead. I plugged in the drive, loaded the slides, and stepped onto the stage. The room was packed, industry giants staring up at me expectantly. My heart pounded as I clicked to the first slide, ready to deliver my rehearsed speech. But the screen flickered, and instead of my polished intro, a cartoon dog appeared. The audience chuckled, and I froze, my mind racing. What was happening? Had Emma sabotaged me? I glanced at her in the wings. She winked. I took a deep breath and decided to roll with it. This was not the plan, but I had to trust her. The cartoon dog danced across the screen, and the audience's laughter grew louder, breaking the tension. I improvised, joking about how my dog inspired my work ethic, light and playful. The next slide popped up, a meme about coding late at night, relatable and absurd. The crowd roared, some nodding knowingly, others clapping. I was still sweating, but their energy fueled me. Emma's grin from the sidelines told me she'd planned this chaos. My original slides were dry, facts, figures, charts, no soul. These new slides were bold, irreverent, and oddly engaging. I leaned into it, weaving my expertise into the humor. Each slide was a surprise. GIFs, pop culture references, even a fake Error 404 slide. The audience was eating it up, their phones out, snapping photos. I felt a shift, less like a lecturer, more like a storyteller. Was this what Emma intended? To make me connect? By the third slide, I was in sync with the room, their laughter my rhythm. A graph appeared, but it was styled like a comic book panel, data bursting with color. I explained the numbers, tying them to a story about my first failed startup. The audience leaned in, hanging on my words, not just the visuals. Emma's slides weren't random, they were strategic, humanizing my expertise. I'd always played it safe, but this was raw, real. A slide with a Star Wars quote tied to innovation had the crowd cheering. I glanced at Emma. She gave a thumbs up, her confidence infectious. I was no longer presenting, I was performing. The slides forced me to think on my feet, to be authentic. My fear of failure melted away with each laugh. This wasn't just a talk, it was a moment. I could feel the room's energy lifting me higher. Halfway through, a slide showed a photo of my team, captioned with a cheesy motivational quote. The audience clapped, some even whistling, as I shared our struggles and wins. Emma had dug into my personal files for this. She knew me better than I thought. I told a story about our late-night coding sessions, fueled by pizza and hope. The crowd related, their faces warm, engaged, alive. Another slide had a poll. Who's burned out from deadlines? Hands shot up, laughter rippling. I was connecting on a level I'd never reached before. My original slides would have bored them. Emma's version was a conversation. I felt like a stand-up comedian with a PhD. The next slide was a video clip of me tripping at a hackathon. The room erupted, and I laughed too, owning it. Emma had turned my vulnerabilities into strengths. The slides kept coming, each one a curveball I caught and threw back with flair. A chart about market trends was styled like a retro video game, pixels and all. I explained the data while joking about my gaming addiction as a kid. The audience was with me, their energy electric, feeding mine. Emma's choices were genius. She'd stripped away my corporate armor. A slide with a quote from my mentor hit hard, tying to my core message. I shared a personal story about doubt and perseverance, my voice steady. The crowd was silent now, absorbing every word, then clapping softly. I realized Emma hadn't just switched slides, she'd rewritten my approach. I wasn't just informing, I was inspiring. The clock was ticking, but I didn't want this to end. The stage felt like home. A slide popped up with a bold question: why do we innovate? The audience leaned forward, intrigued. I spoke from the heart, no script, about passion driving progress, not just profit. The room was quiet, then burst into applause, louder than before. Emma's slides had forced me to ditch my robotic delivery. Another slide showed a meme of a cat coding, silly but effective. I tied it to creativity in problem solving, and the crowd loved it. I was no longer nervous. I was thriving. Emma stood in the wings, arms crossed, smiling like she'd won a bet. She'd taken a risk, and it was paying off. The next slide was a blank screen with one word: dream. I paused, letting it sink in, then shared my vision. The audience was spellbound, and so was I. As I hit the 10th slide, I felt like a rock star, the crowd hanging on my every word. It was a photo of me as a kid, dreaming of tech, paired with a futuristic cityscape. I talked about chasing impossible goals, my voice cracking with emotion. The audience clapped, some standing, their energy overwhelming. Emma's slides had turned my talk into a journey, not a lecture. A graph about AI growth was styled like a sci-fi movie poster, bold and fun. I explained it with passion, not jargon, and they got it. Another slide had a quote: fail fast, learn faster. I shared my biggest flop, laughing at myself. The crowd laughed too, but with respect, not mockery. Emma had unlocked something in me. This was my best talk ever. The next slide was a live poll via QR code, Emma's idea, no doubt. I asked the audience to vote on the biggest tech challenge. Phones lit up, and results appeared in real time, sparking gasps. I riffed on the data, tying it to my core points with ease. The crowd was engaged, part of the story, not just spectators. A slide with a superhero graphic asked, "Who's your hero?" I shared mine, my first boss, who believed in me. The audience clapped, some tearing up, as I got emotional. Emma's slides weren't just visuals, they were prompts for connection. Another slide showed a timeline of my career, quirky and honest. I narrated it like a friend, not a CEO. The room felt like a community now. Slide after slide, I was in a flow state, the audience riding the wave with me. A meme about imposter syndrome hit home, and I admitted my own doubts. The crowd nodded, some shouting encouragement, making me smile. Emma's gamble was a masterstroke. She'd made me relatable. A slide with a rocket launching tied to innovation goals was next. I spoke about bold risks, my voice strong, confident. The audience clapped, their energy palpable, urging me on. Another slide had a quote from a sci-fi novel I loved. I tied it to dreaming big, and the room erupted again. Emma had turned my talk into a performance art piece. I was no longer just a speaker, I was a storyteller, a leader. The final slide of the block was a group photo of the audience from last year's conference. I thanked them for being part of this journey, my voice sincere. The crowd cheered, some standing, their applause thunderous. Emma's slides had transformed my talk into something unforgettable. I glanced at her. She was clapping too, her eyes proud. I realized this wasn't just about slides. It was about trust. She'd pushed me to be better, to be real. The audience's energy was electric, carrying me forward. I ended the block with a tease. Stick around, more surprises coming. They laughed, eager for more. I was no longer the nervous exec from an hour ago. I was unstoppable. The second block kicked off with a slide of a chaotic desk, mine, I admitted, laughing. The audience chuckled, relating to the mess of creativity. I shared how disorder often sparks my best ideas. Emma's slide choice was perfect, grounding my expertise in humanity. The next slide was a graph, but styled like a treasure map, data as X marks the spot. I explained market trends as a quest, keeping it light but sharp. The crowd was hooked, their eyes bright, engaged. Another slide showed a meme of a loading bar at 99%. I joked about project delays, and they roared. Emma had nailed the balance of humor and insight. I felt like I was chatting with friends, not presenting. The stage was my playground now. A slide with a bold quote, "Risk is the price of progress," stopped the laughter. I shared a story about a failed product launch, raw and honest. The audience listened, silent, then clapped, moved by my candor. Emma's slides were peeling back layers I'd hidden. The next slide was a gif of a rocket crashing, then relaunching. I tied it to resilience, and the crowd cheered, some standing. I was hitting every note, thanks to Emma's vision. Another slide showed a photo of my first office, a tiny closet. I laughed, sharing how far we'd come. The audience loved it, their warmth wrapping around me. Emma had turned my talk into a story of growth, not just success. The energy in the room was electric as a slide with a brain graphic appeared. I dove into AI's future, but Emma's slide made it a comic strip, not a lecture. The crowd laughed, then listened as I broke down complex ideas simply. Another slide had a poll, "What's your biggest fear in tech?" Results flashed up, sparking murmurs. I addressed their fears with empathy, not stats. Emma's slides were guiding me to connect, not just inform. A video clip of a robot dancing came next, and I tied it to innovation's joy. The audience clapped, their energy infectious. I was no longer just presenting, I was inspiring. Emma had unlocked a side of me I'd forgotten. A slide with a quote from a famous inventor hit hard, "Failure is just practice." I shared my early career flops, laughing at my mistakes. The audience laughed too, but their applause felt like respect. Emma's slides were making me vulnerable, and it worked. The next slide was a timeline of tech breakthroughs, styled like a comic book. I narrated it with passion, tying it to my company's mission. The crowd was with me, their faces alive, engaged. Another slide showed a meme about debugging life. I riffed on work-life balance, and they roared. Emma's choices were bold, brilliant, human. I felt like a conductor, the audience my orchestra. Halfway through the block, a slide asked, "What's your why?" I paused, letting the question sink in. I shared my purpose, using tech to solve real problems. The audience clapped, some tearing up as I got personal. Emma's slide was a gut punch, forcing me to dig deep. The next slide was a photo of my team brainstorming, messy and real. I talked about collaboration, my voice warm, sincere. The crowd nodded, relating to the chaos of teamwork. Another slide had a gif of a light bulb flickering. I tied it to moments of clarity in chaos. The audience cheered, their energy lifting me higher. Emma had turned my talk into a movement. A slide with a futuristic cityscape appeared, captioned, "What's next?" I shared my vision for tech's future, bold and unfiltered. The audience leaned in, their silence a sign of respect. Emma's slide was a call to dream big, and I answered it. The next slide was a meme about overthinking code. I laughed, sharing a story about my perfectionism. The crowd roared, relating to the struggle. Another slide showed a quote, "Build what matters." I tied it to my company's ethos, my voice steady. The audience clapped, their energy palpable. Emma's slides were pushing me to be bold, authentic. I was no longer just a speaker, I was a visionary. The next slide was a live tweet feed from the conference, hashtags buzzing. I read a few, joking about the audience's wit. They laughed, phones out, tweeting more. Emma had made this interactive, alive. Another slide showed a graph of user growth, styled like a video game level up. I explained it with enthusiasm, not jargon, and they got it. The crowd clapped, some whistling, their energy infectious. A slide with a photo of my dog appeared, captioned Chief Morale Officer. I shared a light story, and they loved it. Emma's slides were weaving humor and heart seamlessly. I felt like I was soaring, the audience with me. A slide with a bold question, "What's your legacy?" hit hard. I shared my hopes for impact, my voice raw, honest. The audience was silent, then erupted in applause, some standing. Emma's slide had forced me to bare my soul. The next slide was a meme about crunch time. I joked about deadlines, and they laughed, relating. I tied it to discipline, and they nodded, engaged. Another slide showed a photo of my first prototype, clunky and crude. I shared its story, laughing at my naivety. The audience clapped, their warmth wrapping around me. Emma's slides were turning my talk into a legacy, not just a moment. The energy was sky-high as a slide with a rocket launch appeared. I talked about bold goals, my voice strong, confident. The audience cheered, their energy electric, urging me on. Emma's slide was a call to action, and I answered it. The next slide was a poll. What's your next step? Results flashed up, sparking murmurs. I riffed on their answers, tying them to my message. Another slide had a quote from a sci-fi movie I loved. I tied it to dreaming big, and the crowd roared. Emma's slides were a masterclass in engagement. I was no longer just presenting, I was leading. The stage felt like my domain. The final slide of the block was a photo of the audience, taken live via drone. I thanked them for their energy, my voice sincere. The crowd erupted, standing, their applause thunderous. Emma's slides had turned my talk into a shared experience. I glanced at her. She was beaming, proud. This wasn't just about slides, it was about connection. I ended the block with a promise, "We're not done yet." They laughed, eager for more. I was no longer the nervous exec from the start. I was a storyteller, a leader, a visionary. Emma had given me wings, and I was flying. The audience was my wind. The final block began with a slide of a sunrise, captioned New Beginnings. I shared my company's next big project, my voice brimming with excitement. The audience leaned in, their faces alive, intrigued. Emma's slide set the tone, hopeful, bold, inspiring. The next slide was a meme about tech life, chaotic and funny. I tied it to the grind of innovation, and they laughed, relating. Another slide showed a graph of our growth, styled like a comic book explosion. I explained it with passion, not numbers, and they got it. The crowd clapped, their energy lifting me higher. Emma's slides were keeping me real, relatable. I felt like I was sharing a vision, not just data. A slide with a quote, "The future is now," hit hard. I talked about seizing the moment, my voice strong, urgent. The audience clapped, some standing, their applause thunderous. Emma's slide was a rallying cry, and I answered it. The next slide was a photo of my team celebrating a milestone. I shared their story, my voice warm, proud. The crowd nodded, relating to the power of teamwork. Another slide had a gif of a rocket soaring. I tied it to our ambitions, and they cheered. Emma's slides were weaving a narrative of hope and hustle. I was no longer just presenting, I was inspiring a movement. The energy was electric as a slide with a bold question appeared, "What's your impact?" I shared my mission to change lives through tech, raw and honest. The audience was silent, then erupted, some tearing up. Emma's slide had forced me to dig deep, and it worked. The next slide was a meme about coding bugs. I laughed, sharing a story about a near disaster. The crowd roared, relating to the chaos. Another slide showed a timeline of our projects, styled like a sci-fi saga. I narrated it with passion, tying it to our vision. The audience clapped, their energy palpable. Emma's slides were turning my talk into a legacy. A slide with a live poll appeared, "What's your dream project?" Results flashed up, sparking gasps. I riffed on their answers, tying them to my message of innovation. The crowd was engaged, part of the story, not just spectators. Another slide showed a photo of my first hackathon, messy and young. I shared its story, laughing at my inexperience. The audience loved it, their warmth wrapping around me. Emma's slides were making me vulnerable, relatable. The next slide was a quote, "Build what lasts." I tied it to sustainable tech, my voice steady. The crowd cheered, their energy infectious. I was soaring now. The next slide was a video clip of our latest product in action, sleek and bold. I explained its impact, my voice brimming with pride. The audience clapped, some whistling, their excitement palpable. Emma's slide was a showstopper, and I leaned into it. Another slide had a meme about tech burnout. I joked about self-care, and they laughed, relating. I tied it to balance, and they nodded, engaged. A slide with a futuristic robot appeared, captioned, "What's next?" I shared our AI goals, bold and unfiltered. The crowd roared, their energy lifting me higher. Emma's slides were a masterclass in storytelling. I felt like a visionary, not just a speaker. A slide with a quote from my favorite book appeared, "Dreams shape reality." I shared my personal journey, my voice raw, honest. The audience was silent, then erupted in applause, some standing. Emma's slide had forced me to bare my soul, and it worked. The next slide was a graph of market trends, styled like a neon billboard. I explained it with enthusiasm, not jargon, and they got it. Another slide showed a photo of my dog, captioned, "Chief Inspiration Officer." I shared a light story, and they loved it. Emma's slides were weaving humor and heart seamlessly. I was no longer just presenting, I was connecting on a human level. The energy was sky-high as a slide with a rocket launch appeared. I talked about our boldest goals, my voice strong, confident. The audience cheered, their energy electric, urging me on. Emma's slide was a call to action, and I answered it. The next slide was a poll. "What's your next big idea?" Results flashed up, sparking murmurs. I riffed on their answers, tying them to my message. Another slide had a quote from a tech pioneer I admired. I tied it to innovation's legacy, and the crowd roared. Emma's slides were pushing me to be bold, authentic. I was no longer just a speaker, I was a leader, a dreamer. A slide with a live tweet feed appeared, hashtags buzzing with praise. I read a few, joking about the audience's wit. They laughed, phones out, tweeting more. Emma had made this interactive, alive. Another slide showed a graph of our impact, styled like a superhero comic. I explained it with passion, not numbers, and they got it. The crowd clapped, some whistling, their energy infectious. A slide with a photo of my team appeared, captioned, "We are the future." I shared their story, my voice warm, proud. The audience nodded, relating to the power of teamwork. Emma's slides were turning my talk into a movement, not just a moment. The penultimate slide was a photo of the audience, taken live, captioned, "You are the change." I thanked them for their energy, my voice sincere, emotional. The crowd erupted, standing, their applause thunderous. Emma's slides had turned my talk into a shared journey. I glanced at her. She was tearing up, proud. This wasn't just about slides, it was about trust, connection, courage. The next slide was a simple quote, "Together, we soar." I tied it to collaboration, my voice steady, strong. The audience clapped, their warmth wrapping around me. Emma had given me a gift, a chance to be real. I was no longer the nervous exec. I was a storyteller, a visionary, a leader. The final slide was a blank screen with one word, "Thank you." I paused, letting the moment sink in, then spoke from the heart. I thanked Emma, my team, and the audience for this unforgettable journey. The room exploded in applause, a standing ovation that shook the walls. I stood there, overwhelmed, as they clapped and cheered. Emma's gamble had paid off. She'd made me shine. I shared one last story about believing in risks, my voice raw. The audience was with me, their energy a tidal wave. I ended with a smile, my heart full. This wasn't just a talk. It was a triumph. Emma had switched my slides, but she'd also switched my perspective. I bowed, and the crowd roared louder. What a ride! Thanks for joining me on this journey. Please subscribe to the channel for more stories and inspiration. Let's keep this energy going.